Welcome to Lesson 5, where we're going to talk about pattern management. For a lot of beginning knitters, a pattern can feel like a lifeline. You feel like you want to follow it exactly and make sure that you don't miss any tiny step. You may not yet be comfortable reading your knitting to assess where you are in a pattern, and if you make a mistake, you might feel like you need to rip back all the way, row after row, until you get back to a place in the pattern where you feel comfortable and you feel pretty sure that you know what's going on with the instructions. I'm here to tell you that as you gain more experience as a knitter, all of this will get a little bit easier, and you'll even be able to make changes to a pattern as you go along. But for now, and especially if this is your first pattern, I want to ease your fears about getting lost. I also want to help you manage some of the more challenging parts of a pattern, such as following a chart. Finally, I want to help you find support when you need it from tutorials and other resources online and offline. Let's start with the basics first. How do you keep track of where you are in a pattern? I'll admit my favorite thing to do is to have a paper, pattern, and a pencil nearby. I'm old-fashioned that way. I've shown you some digital patterns on here, but I tend to work in a hard copy on paper with pencil. As I work through a pattern, I'll put little check marks by sections that I've finished. And if it's a particularly complicated portion of a pattern with multiple rows or rounds, I'll use a post-it note to help me move through these so that I can keep track of where I am. Now, if you're using a digital pattern, you might use the sticky note function or the comment function to help you keep track of where you are. You could also use that highlight function if you haven't already used it to mark up the sizing in your pattern. You don't want to confuse your two highlights. Now, in sections of a pattern where there are repeats, you can use a row counter or even hash marks in the margins of the pattern to keep track of which repeat you're working. I may also write down the row that I began or ended a repeat so that I have that information if I ever did need to rip back. So for example, if I'm working and I know there was a certain repeat or row, like at a crucial moment, like dividing for the arms or working down to a particular part of the hem, I might note which row I was on right when I did that change. Now, if I did make any changes to the pattern, such as working fewer stitches or adding a decrease or not working a repeat, I would note that in the margins as well, just in case I need to go back and remember what I've done in the pattern. With a little bit of experience, you will be able to read your knitting to tell where you are in a pattern. And I remember that was kind of like the golden goal when I started knitting, and it took me many years to get to that point. You might even begin to leave markers for yourself on the fabric of your knitting that will help clue you in to which section of the pattern you're working on. For example, when I'm working decreases down a sleeve, I often pin a reclosable stitch marker at each decrease that I complete so that then I can count my rows between decreases more easily. Doing little things like that can help you start to learn to read your knitting so that you're less dependent on hash marks that you've made on the side of a pattern. Now remember, there are lots of ways to keep track of your knitting. There's really not one right way. Whatever works for you is going to be the best way to keep track of where you are in a pattern. But a word of caution. Always leave a note to yourself about where you are in a pattern when you put your knitting down, even for a moment. It's easy to believe that we're coming right back and that we'll remember where we are. But whips do languish in project bags, and when you pick them back up, it's really nice if your former self left you a note about where you were in the pattern. Okay, let's talk about some special situations in knitting where you're not only trying to keep track of where you are in a pattern, but you're also trying to keep track of where you are in a chart. Patterns that include lace, colorwork, and cables are often charted, as we've seen so far, and you'll need to know how to read a chart and keep good track of a chart in order to be successful with your project. As with the pattern itself, there are many ways to keep track of where you are in a chart. If you're using digital software, you could highlight the row that you're working on. If you have a paper copy of a pattern, you could use a post-it note or one of these really cool magnetized chart keepers to mark your place. Keep in mind that most charts are read from the bottom to the top, and if they're knit in the round, they're usually read from the right to the left. If you're using a chart that includes wrong side rows, you'll need to note that so that you can read those rows of the chart from left to right usually. Now, when I first started reading charts, I often kept track from the bottom up by putting a post-it note or my long magnetic strip under the row that I was currently working on. It was only later that I realized it would be more effective to keep my post-it note or my magnetic strip on top of or above the row that I was working. Now, this is for a couple of reasons. First and most importantly, if you have your marker set above the row that you're working on, you can then see all of the rows that you previously worked on below it. With more experience, you'll be able to read your knitting, and being able to see the row just below the one that you're working on will help ensure that you're in the right place as you work across the chart. But even beginning knitters can learn a lot by keeping track of their charts in this manner. You can start to look at the stitch below the one that you're knitting to see what it looks like on the chart and in real life. So keeping your chart marker above that row that you're working is a really great primer for learning to read your knitting for lace and cables and colorwork. If you're new to charts, you can also look for patterns that include both charted and written directions. These patterns allow you to cross-check your knitting because you can practice reading the chart and then check your work by looking at the written directions for that row. While some knitters prefer to stay with written directions for their entire knitting career, many of us move over to all charted instructions at some point. A lot of us find them easier to visualize and follow for cables, colorwork, and lace because you can actually kind of see the relationship of the yarn overs or the holes in the knitting for lace and the ways that the cables are crossing or which color is supposed to be right above another color. But I would absolutely recommend patterns that include both charted and written instructions for beginners and advanced knitters. I think it's great when designers recognize that not everyone knits or learns the same way or reads a pattern the same way. And once you've learned how to manage your patterns and your charts, knitting from a pattern will hopefully feel less daunting and you'll be less likely to be white-knuckling it as you're casting on and continuing through the pattern that you're knitting. At the end of this lesson and the end of this class, I'd like to offer one other piece of advice, especially to new knitters who are encountering patterns for the first time. Don't be afraid to ask for help or to seek it out on your own terms. I can remember just how challenging some of my first patterns were to knit. Every pattern seemed to have some new terminology or some new stitch, and I didn't know what they looked like or how to execute them. But I never wanted those challenges to keep me from diving into a pattern that I was really excited about. So I bought a few books and I started watching a lot of YouTube videos. There's a tutorial out there for just about everything. So if you encounter a stitch that you don't know or a symbol that you've never seen before, you have a few options. First, you might ask a friend. If you have a knitting friend who has more experience than you, or you have a local yarn store nearby, they often offer support and instruction for beginning knitters. Great places to go. Second, consider your local library. There are tons of knitting books, both historical and contemporary, that have lots and lots of explanations of different techniques and stitches and support for patterns and charts. And in those cases, if you're that kind of learner, you're going to see a visual representation of the stitch oftentimes with a paragraph or a couple of sentences describing how to execute that stitch. Now, if you learn visually and you happen to have access to the internet, Google and YouTube are your friend. Friends. There are so many tutorials on just about every aspect of knitting that you can probably find what you're looking for simply by going online. Sometimes it's tricky to know what your search term is, but try to start with the search term from the pattern and then go from there and see what you find. Finally, you can always contact the designer or the company where the pattern came from. They can usually provide contact information in the pattern itself so that you can get in touch with them. But there are also Ravelry groups dedicated to particular designers or to particular styles of garment. I know Isabel Kramer has a Ravelry group where someone runs the kind of pattern support for her. Joining or reading those forums can provide an answer to your question. I'd like to take a minute at the end of this class to thank you for sitting down with me to hear about how I read a sweater pattern. I hope it's been helpful to you, and I'd love to know how you guys go about reading your patterns and what strategies and tips you'd want to share with each other. So please share or send me an email. Thanks so much, and I'll see you in the next class.